Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar titled, Could Your Use of Windows Backup Be Opening the Door to Hackers? My name is Kevin Collins from Unitrends, and I'm here with Joe Noonan, our Vice President of Product Marketing, and he'll be taking us through the presentation today. Don't forget, one lucky attendee will be walking away with a $100 Amazon gift card, and we'll contact the winner via email after the webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar. I would also encourage you to ask questions during the presentation. You can do so by typing them into the bottom right corner of the player. We'll answer any of your questions at the end of the session. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joe. Enjoy the presentation, and Joe, take it away.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Can you give me a quick verification?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
All right, great. I saw that someone asked a question about sound. Just wanted to make sure we were okay. I hear you just fine. You hear me, so I think we're good. Everybody, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to spend it with us. Naturally, I think we have a pretty interesting and top-of-mind topic right now, and has to do with the idea of malware, hackers, and especially ransomware, which is continuing to be an epidemic in our industry. For folks in IT, you're dealing with so many issues, so many complexities around changing technologies, so much growth in data and in what you have to actually be able to protect and manage, not to mention, outside of data protection and disaster recovery and continuity. What's even more important is that you're not spending that much time on those things. You're spending your time on keeping the production environment healthy and performing so that your business can basically thrive off of it. And then on top of it, you have things like ransomware that just seem to be growing and growing in an amazing new way. So hopefully, if we're lucky here, you'll have walked away learning some interesting things for your organization's backup and continuity needs, some best practices and things to look out for when it comes to this particular scenario. I noticed that we talked a little bit about focusing on Windows, and we are going to spend a good bit of time on backup architectures, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. When it comes to ransomware itself, this is obviously a pretty scary threat at this point, and not scary in the way that people aren't able to get around it and have good solutions, and we're going to talk about that. But just scary in the sense that you would think it could be stopped by now, but it just doesn't seem to be the case. It's pretty much here to stay. It's a billion-dollar industry in 2016. Believe it or not, that grew from a much, much, much smaller number in 2015, which I think was more around like 24, 25 million. That's a pretty amazing growth in 1 year. You think about companies growing like that, to be a phenomenal, phenomenal trajectory. The ransomware as an industry has certainly sparked up. And to be honest, the government is saying that basically there are 4,000 attacks released daily. So when you think about the difficulty in stopping it, that's obviously a big part. And that momentum is continued to evolve and expected to continue based on what a lot of analysts like Gartner and others are saying. And it's even turned into something that is almost commercialized very, very easily. There's actually ransomware as a service. You can even YouTube. I found one. I'm actually from Philadelphia. I found a YouTube that basically was called Philadelphia Ransomware, and it shows you how easy it is for anybody to pretty much sign up and get going. And kind of the distributor will often take about 70% of the pie, and the developer of the platform and the software behind the scenes can take their cut, about 30%. So it's becoming something that's pretty easy for people to get their hands on. I'm not going to get into a lot of the definitions around it. You see some interesting stats here and kind of a plug of one of our ebooks. This will talk in detail about ransomware, the types that are out there, and some of the threats you face, and it goes into that whole process of ransomware and what's happening there, and the solution a little bit in good measure. So I'll leave the ebook to be, I think, a good reference for folks, and naturally, we're trying to give you kind of different levels of content here in a short period. So this is definitely a good resource for folks to go back and take a look at. Now, what's interesting about this epidemic is that sometimes there's a lot of thoughts that, well, they're coming in and ransomware hackers are very often basically asking for small amounts of money. And that's true in a lot of cases. Sometimes it's a few $100 bucks. Remember, they are attacking consumers as well as businesses. But what we're actually seeing is that 50% of businesses from the attacks that were made on those businesses actually pay more than $10K and 20% more than $40K. So, these aren't tiny amounts of money. People don't want to have to deal with something like this, even if you're a large organization with lots of budget. It's just not the kind of thing you'd want to spend your money on. So it can be impactful. And we all know that downtime is even more costly. Just looking at 2016 alone in North America alone, downtime costs $700 billion, and ransomware is creating a form of downtime. So ultimately, when you start weighing those options between each other, do I pay that amount for the ransom? Do I worry about being down and have my data unavailable to me? Depending on your industry, you can even see that this is not official FBI positioning, but it was actually kind of slipped and talked about by one person from the FBI, Joseph Bonavolanta, and he had said, often it's that good, we often just tell people to pay the ransom if they don't have backups. And that's a scary thing to kind of think about, that our FBI who's out there really trying to stop this because of how many different permutations are releasing daily. It's just very difficult for them to stop, and that's where really ransomware has become a different conversation for vendors like Unitrends and others in our space. We typically sell to folks in IT, folks that are looking to protect a slew of devices, a slew of servers and applications, and they're looking for advanced ways of being able to recover, whether that's on-premise, off-site, at a secondary location of their own, or in a colo, or even in the cloud. And in doing that, it wasn't very often that Unitrends and other backup vendors would be pulled into conversations specifically around security, but this is becoming a board-level conversation where CSOs and CIOs are talking with senior executives in companies trying to figure out what they're going to do about this ransomware problem. And backup has become, honestly, one of the most important ways of being able to get around this problem without having to pay that ransom or without losing data and minimizing the downtime. But it isn't that you can just get any backup solution in place. Unitrends, we've been in the industry for a long time. I've had customer calls personally myself, but I know our team has shared many, many stories with me where we've replaced vendors because backups ultimately weren't good. And while there are right ways of doing things, you do have to consider a lot in order to put together the right solution for this particular problem. It's not that any backup vendor is going to suit the problem. Naturally, a lot do the protect and the recover side of this, what you're seeing here in terms of the spectrum, and we're going to dig in a lot in terms of all these different areas. So you'll get plenty of content related to and best practices related to each portion of this kind of solution spectrum you see here. But when we kind of think about the middle three, we're going to spend the most time there. So I think when we look at the topic of this particular conversation, can a backup solution be a gateway for ransomware and other forms of malware? And not that this isn't about pointing fingers or picking on other vendors. The idea is just that a lot of folks have lived with architectures around backup that have been around a very long time. It's difficult for vendors to change those architectures, and problems in the industry obviously shift over time to where different types of solutions are going to be better solutions for those problems. And the answer is yes. I mean, certain backup architectures can ultimately lead to the backup systems themselves being infected at a much higher probability than other solutions. So it kind of really becomes a point where ransomware needs to sort of be part of your evaluation criteria. It could be part of the problem that you're dealing with right now, and that's why you might be looking at vendors, and that's why you might be trying to figure out solutions. But in the end, when you do start looking at backup and continuity, whether it's additional projects, because you might be adding storage, you might be adding infrastructure that you need to protect, you might be looking to modify your SLAs around your current solution, and that might lead you to take a look at other vendors and other solutions out there. And one thing I think that's important to realize here is that I think ransomware is a part of that evaluation criteria, given how important it's been for the industry these days. So since there are obviously some architectures that are what we're saying less secure, right, when we think about that security piece, who's really less secure and why? So what we've seen spending time with our customers And this is what they've reported, when they failed to be able to recover from a ransomware attack, is that ransomware is obviously targeting Windows much, much, much more frequently than Linux. I mean, it's staggering the difference, right? And that makes sense. Ransomware grew to $1 billion. Windows is a great place to go and attack in that sense. And that's not to knock Windows. It's absolutely required and just abundant and prolific in many, many environments. But the idea here is that with it being targeted as much as it's being targeted, it is very difficult to prevent those attacks. And when backup vendors build their architectures on Windows, that allows them to be susceptible to those attacks as well, right? Their backup is supposed to be your insurance policy here. It's what saves you from ransomware, from having to pay, and it can be hit as well when it is a part of that highly targeted segment of the ransomware market. And you can see this public information on a lot of these incidents out there. Not picking on certain competitors, but even just looking at forums from some of them, Veeam and others that I've seen, they talk about people that have been hit by ransomware and their backups are corrupted and impacted as well. So obviously it's a stronger market, so it's highly targeted. And there are even a lot of new variants like Ladder Rebo Locker, which is a crazy word to say, but it specifically exploits Windows registries to basically show the ransom node, disable task manager so you can't kill the process and do its thing around encrypting data. So ultimately, it leverages kind of that Windows underpinning to be able to do whatever it wants to do to maliciously hurt you and IT. Now, what else is out there? It's not just about Windows itself. When we talk about a backup architecture, obviously we're talking about something broader, right? So when we think about management complexity, you can harden Windows. You can obviously secure it. There's a lot of things you can do to really do your best to prevent ransomware, although with 4,000 permutations being released daily, that's not an easy feat, which is why no matter what, you do need to make sure that you're considering that alternative solution around backup and recovery to help you here as a part of that story. But management complexity around this is a big part of it as well. Right, being able to keep up with the updates, the configuration management, and everything that goes along with Windows is not an easy feat for all of us in IT to be able to manage, especially at broad scale, right? We have tools and processes and automation to try to do that, but that ultimately means, wow, I have to have tools, processes, and automation to handle this because it's pretty complex. Now, when we think about backup architectures, because I was just talking about, managing Windows there, but imagine the typical architecture you kind of see from a lot of incumbent vendors that are out there today. You'll have a backup server or a media server, and that'll do a lot of the management and scheduling. You'll have proxies, and that's where you can offload a lot of the data movement. You'll have backup repositories, which are servers that will act as targets for your backups. Then you might have dedicated WAN accelerators. These are components of a backup architecture that help data move quickly and securely over the internet and to secondary sites. And then some vendors in their architecture will also say, okay, you want to centrally manage all this stuff? Guess what? That requires another dedicated server. And that'll allow you to do different role-based self-service types of capabilities. And by the way, if you want to monitor and report on all of this, that's another server. That'll handle your analytics and monitoring capabilities. So there's a lot there, naturally. Sorry, I went a little too fast there. There's a lot there in that one architecture that in a production environment, now you have upwards of 10 to 15 Windows machines that are just a part of backup that you now need to worry about securing because they can all impact your backup strategy. So it's not just Windows, it's also the management complexity around the architecture of backup. And when you combine the two together, you obviously get a much more susceptible situation when it comes to malware and ransomware. And that's where kind of the new world approach that we've been seeing here is looking at hardened Linux backup appliances, which are much less susceptible versus those targeted susceptible Windows software vendors that you typically see today. Ransomware is going at Windows predominantly, and obviously with many folks being hit, those incumbent backup solutions are starting to really look at this new approach because it's just one less thing that they have to worry about when you start considering ransomware as a part of the solutions that you need to cover with your IT strategy. So why is it more secure? Right, a lot of you manage Linux, and we've all seen that Linux is still susceptible to security threats. There even are ransomware flavors that go after Linux, although far, far fewer and much less successful than what is out there for Windows. But what really makes kind of a Linux backup appliance more secure when it comes to ransomware and malware? First part is that it's less targeted. We just mentioned that. But the hardened part, I think, is a key to this as well. Backup appliances are typically only going to turn on what you need for backup, right? Whereas if you have an architecture that's Windows-based and has all those components we mentioned before, it's kind of up to you now to manage the security and the patching and everything else that goes on those machines. Not to mention you also have to manage the hardware, the operating system, any monitoring software that might be a part of that solution at the server level, storage as well, which could be separate. So all those components that add complexity to your environment and just your backup solution all kind of need to be managed by you. Whereas in a hardened Linux appliance, that's all taken care of from the appliance itself, right? It's only there for that one purpose. So the services, the processes, the networking ports are only just enough is open, and by default it's locked down pretty more. So if you need to open it more, you can, but they come down by default pretty locked down. They come out pretty locked down by default, and that helps on the security. And that's kind of when we look at this all-in-one simplicity and integrated security. It takes away the security management and ultimately locks things down and only opens up what's needed, and it takes all these components that you typically see in an incumbent and legacy backup infrastructure. And when I say legacy, there are even newer vendors that are virtualization specific that still have this kind of legacy architecture to the way that they've designed it. And when you look at a backup appliance, all that can basically be covered in one box. And of course, you can scale out, you can scale up, you can extend to the cloud pretty transparently, but it truly, truly simplifies your backup solution, and that simplicity also helps you with the management of security, which helps you prevent things like ransomware hitting your backups. So what else is important here when we think about beating ransomware? It's not just about securing those backups, right? That first part was really about how kind of your incumbent Windows-based architecture, one that's very distributed, can be much more difficult to sort of stave off your backups being hit as well, because the backups are your saving point here if ransomware happens. So we think about what else is good, a known good backup. It sounds really, really rudimentary to mention this, but a lot of the folks that we've ultimately seen come through our support organization that have been hit by ransomware and weren't employing some of the advanced techniques we're going to talk about in a little bit, what they ultimately found was, you know, basically they were hit by ransomware, they went back to one of their backups. The last one had already been hit by ransomware as well. Shoot, now I got to go back to an early one. That one also, now I got to go back to an early one. And they go through this really painful process, right, trying to find your last good recovery point. And it's not just ransomware that could be impacting those older backups. There's a lot of risks out there to good backups that are obviously that you have to fight day in and day out, whether ransomware is involved or not. So going back to kind of our 5 ways that the right backup solution will fight ransomware, we think about testing, right? This becomes often ignored, but recovery testing is a huge, huge part of any backup and continuity strategy. And I think that's becoming more prevalent, but it's still very painful sounding. It's arduous sounding. And automation around this is becoming a lot more prevalent, and that's great. But there are some nuances to kind of the automated verification that's out there today, right? It's not good enough to just say, well, I booted things up and I can see a screenshot. I booted things up, because by the way, that screenshot could be ransomware. I booted things up and well, I'm sorry, I did like a little bit of a data integrity check at different points. Well, there are things that can actually impact data integrity that's going to make it look like you backed up the exact data that you read on the production side, yet the production side had some an API from VMware, for instance, for change block tracking actually corrupted that data as part of the backup process. So there are issues, and that's why you have a new kind of term that's being out there in the industry these days called IT resilience. And that need for confidence around a recovery strategy is pushing this trend, right? Things kind of started out with backup, and then you're looking at DR as kind of a way to keep companies up and running. And then, of course, an extension of that is DR as a service when people don't have a secondary site. And a DR strategy for them in the past might have been to wait a couple of days to get tapes back from Iron Mountain. You know, now you can leverage cloud-based DR as a service to obviously add significant improvements to your SLAs around recovery. But then even beyond just having those things in place, knowing that it's all going to work is where you really get the resilience piece in. And this is something that Gartner's been writing about recently. They actually have a nice market guide for IT resilience orchestration automation that talks about some of the vendors that play here in this space, Unitrends being one of them, and it gives you an idea of what the capabilities are for each of these vendors. But I'm obviously going to give you a good bit of information around what Unitrends can do sort of as a way for you to start benchmarking and understanding how to evaluate, right? This isn't just a Unitrends pitch. It's really about you being more aware of some issues and solutions that are out there so that you can get the best one in place for you. So when we think about what it is, a couple nuances to the definition, right? This is about IT serviceability, recovery, and integrity. When we think about serviceability, I think that's an important piece, and it does kind of go along the lines of what we see here around being application-focused across different types of workloads. You haven't recovered from something until your business users are validated to be able to leverage that business service within IT, right? That's the service you're providing, and you need people to be productive. So being able to get a database up and running may not mean anything if you don't have the other components of the application that allow businesses to function at the service level. So I think when you think about IT resilience, it's really about understanding that all of these components are working properly. And a couple of good examples here, I think, where this comes into play and is really important. And by the way, GitLab has nothing to do with ransomware, absolutely nothing. But it has to do with the fact that there are a lot of risks to backups. I think that GitLab's, in their example, was great. Obviously, they're a development platform. They took a hit a little while ago. They did a great job communicating throughout that entire process, but it was caused by the fact that ultimately they did not have good backups. It was just something from a user perspective that caused the downtime. Some files and folders were deleted, and that can happen. But when they went to their backups weren't good. And that's a big part of the risk that people take if you're not employing some of the automation techniques to get resilient in the infrastructure. And another good example, and I think this is a very legitimate one, while it was about a year and a half ago that, well, maybe about 2 years ago that 6.0 was introduced with VMware, they went through 3 different issues with one of their core backup APIs that every backup vendor, pretty much every backup vendor, leverages. And this goes to that conversation before where the backup vendors are reading the data, writing the data, doing integrity checks, everything looks perfect. Production environment has no issues, but because of that API and the issues with that API, unfortunately, we backed up data in a corrupted fashion and the backups were no good. And the only way to understand that these things could exist in the environment, these risks, is to get to a point where you are testing very frequently. And the only way to really be able to do that ultimately is to automate, right? So how do you achieve this? Because you're not going to sit there and manually test this all the time. You're not going to manually test your DR strategy. You're not going to manually test every backup. It's just painful to do that. So when we think about advanced testing and reporting automation, no more praying that backups are going to recover successfully. We talked about all those risks, ransomware being one of them. But even if you're hit by ransomware, you need to be able to trust that your backups are good and not impacted by something else as well. So scrambling during that whole process is obviously what we want to avoid. And being able to prove compliance around this, I think, is a big piece of the puzzle, right? When you spend money on solutions that can provide these types of advanced capabilities, you want to be able to prove to your management and to your organization, to your CEO, whoever it is that you think needs that assurance that you have something in place that is verifying this and can give you business level reporting on it. And I think that those are all critical, right? So we talked about being application level. This is around automation of the entire application process, and that might be a multi-tiered application that has many VMs to it. Being able to proactively uncover those recovery issues, both for physical and virtual environments, and give you that automated reporting and allow you to take advantage of this both locally, any off-site backups as well, because you want those to be good too, right? And we talk about the Unitrends cloud here, but I'll just say generically, if you're doing something like this in the cloud and you're sending your data out there and you're using it for DR as a service, you want to be able to ensure that that workflow is going to work there as well. So under the hood, right, what automation technology is really required here? Because again, I'm talking about nuances because you're going to run into a lot of vendors that can say, yeah, we do automated verification. And I think it's really important to kind of make sure we all kind of understand what are they automating, what are they verifying? Is it really a full recovery to where my business will know that that recovery is working and done and complete? Or is it something much, much earlier and interim to where I don't have the confidence that full recovery is really going to work? given the type of testing that's done. So here are some things you can kind of look for. First is multi-tier applications are going to involve many virtual machines working together so that your business users are actually taking advantage and being productive of the IT environment. So being able to sequence the boot orders within your recovery plans is a big, big part of that. And one thing is you always want to reduce recovery time. So what some products that do allow sequencing to do is they'll actually say, okay, name your boot orders from 1 to N. And not allowing concurrency, because, by the way, and something you can see in the screenshot here, right, I might have 4 machines that can all come up as soon as these first 2 machines are up. And this allows you to have concurrency in the recovery process, but still adhere to the boot order requirements so that the application can come up and running as fast as possible, but also functioning because all the dependencies were up in time and in the right order. The next part is being able to make sure that you're doing application-specific integrity verification. So this is, again, across multi-tiered applications, being able to go in, and Unitrends has a lot of capabilities directly out of the box, right? And this is not a complete list. This just shows a bunch of the Windows side, but on Linux and Unix as well, you can obviously do a lot of really interesting tests. But being able to see that database queries work for responsiveness and for integrity, to be able to see that website responsiveness and checks around, the web server are working, application services are up and running, to ensure all those things are fully functioning so that you know that a business service is available. That's what you want to be able to check. And that's where you typically do see a lot of gaps in the market. And of course, all of this has to prevent you from impacting your production environment. You want to be able to do this at the same time while production is running, so you need network automation. The other component to the network automation is that your environment where you might be recovering to could have a very different network topology. It could be in the cloud, it could be a secondary site, but either way you may have very different networking associated with that particular site, and you need to be able to do various types of virtual networking assignments. You need to be able to remodel the network, because it could actually be a remodeling from VMware to AWS, for instance. And you need to also be able to re-IP machines as well, because it could be a different network segment and subnet out there. And the last piece is the reporting that we talked about. All right, you don't want to spend hours trying to prove that all this is working. It's great that you got this automation technology and you invested in the assurance of recovery in your environment. You want to be able to tell people how great you are for doing that. And this is ultimately what you get out of automation that will give you this compliance reporting at the business level for business stakeholders. It'll show your plan. It'll give you very simple, easy to understand visuals around risk in the environment for what's failed, what's been okay, any warnings related to some of the tests that might have had some issues as a part of that process, because they can happen. We all know that can happen. It's better to be able to proactively find them by doing this automation than to have to deal with it, obviously, after an attack for ransomware or whatever it might have been that took you down. So I know I elaborated a lot there, but I think it was worth it just to kind of help people understand some of the nuances around how automation can help from a testing perspective. Now, the last part has to do with detection, right? And this is where you're getting more advanced solutions, really doing a lot of extra work around ransomware, acknowledging this problem is big, and doing whatever we can to ultimately ensure that you're losing a lot less data. By the way, identifying as quickly as possible that you've been hit by ransomware is a big, big factor in ensuring that you're not losing a lot of data. That story I mentioned earlier about customers coming into support and having to check a whole bunch of backups to find out when the last good one was, well, not only is that a pain from a management perspective, not only does that mean you're down longer, but it also meant that they lost more data because they weren't aware that they were infected. And that's where the detection piece comes in. You can check other vendors. I would absolutely be asking questions around this one and what people do. Unitrends specifically, we actually use a predictive analytics set of algorithms where when we're taking backups in, we're actually analyzing that data. And we're not getting in and understanding data at an insecure level where we actually can access and understand what data we're backing up. What we're able to do with the analytics is understand the data patterns on a per machine basis, so that we ultimately understand over time, we can actually understand what's normal and what's abnormal, depending on those patterns. And we have awareness of obviously various forms of ransomware that we can detect the conditions that are very probabilistic of being hit by a ransomware and flag those very, very quickly for an end user to be able to say, oh, shoot, whether it's an email or whether you're looking at our dashboard, you'll be able to tell, wow, I have a system, I know exactly which system, I need to go check that system. Shoot, I have been hit by ransomware, let me go and recover very quickly using Unitrends. And naturally, of course, we have, instant recovery capabilities that'll be able to spin that machine up very, very quickly in the time it takes to boot. That's about how long you'll be down. But because you recognized it very quickly, and because you were testing and you know you have a good backup, and because you were secure also, because you know you have a good backup, being a Linux hardened appliance, those are the ways that you can really kind of drive assurance to be able to recover from ransomware if you ever are hit by it. And that is a big gap, I think, of a lot of incumbent kind of Windows-based vendors, not just on the security piece, but you also want to look for those advanced automation and detection capabilities and ensure that people are kind of fully addressing the solution. So I have a nice quote here from a customer, who talked about Unitrends, literally paying for itself after they were hit and had to recover 2 million files. And being able to detect and quickly recover from a known good backup was huge for Exco engineering. So that was just a little bit of kind of customer validation at the end. But just in summary, because we're going to wrap up here, appreciate everyone taking their time. Does Windows backup really open the door? Well, it is highly targeted. You have to be very careful in that sense. Again, complex architectures that come along with a lot of those Windows-based designs can make it even more difficult for you to manage the risk. But no matter what, no matter how much you're putting into the security up front to try to prevent ransomware, it is very difficult to prevent it. It can still happen, and you need a good solution you can trust to be able to recover. And leveraging a hardened Linux appliance with advanced automation and detection is ultimately going to, I think, help you get there and beat ransomware a lot better and more effectively. And we've been seeing that, improving it over and over with our customer base and with people switching from other vendors. And wherever you might be in your evaluation stage, whether it's looking at vendors or whether you're just trying to learn about ransomware and solutions around it, hopefully you're able to kind of get a feel for some of the criteria that it's at least good to start asking vendors to give you some of the information around how they're solving this problem very specifically. Because if it's just about backup and recovery, that's not enough these days. So wrapping things up, we always have important things for you to be able to learn more. If this was interesting for you, you can actually try the product itself. We just released 9.2 about a month ago. It includes the ransomware detection feature. You can simply go to our website. I have a URL here, but go to the website. It's easy to find this stuff. And for a limited time, we are still giving away free T-shirts with every download of our virtual appliance version of our product. And that obviously lets you test things out in your own environment, but you can certainly go and purchase a physical appliance like we talked about before, which is kind of the full boat of the solution. But you get a nice T-shirt. Stephen Bliss, he was the guy that did a lot of graphics design for Grand Theft Auto. So pretty cool looking shirt. If you are just looking for more information and want to actually see this in action, we have live demos available all the time, so check out the website under events for that. And if you just want to talk to us a little bit more and learn a bit more outside of the webinar, we're here to help as well. I'll move things over to Kevin and we'll do some Q&A.
All right, Joe, thanks so much. There's still time to ask questions. If you want to do so, just type it into the bottom right of the player. And why don't we get started here with the first question. First question is, you mentioned a lot of stats at the beginning around the cost of downtime. Can you tell me where those sources are for those numbers?
So a lot of the sources we'll use in our literature and our collateral. For instance, if you go to the ebook that I showed, all the sources are footnoted in there, and we have a lot of different ones. For downtime stats and bigger things that I might put on a bigger slide, typically those are coming from Gartner and IDC, typically.
Okay. Next question is, have you seen any case that backed up data is affected with ransomware?
Absolutely. And this is where we talked about some examples out there. I don't kind of plaster forum posts and things like that of competitors out here, but if you go and check some prominent competitors in their forums, you will see incidents of this. If you want to reach out to us offline, we can certainly send you some information about that. But, from a webinar perspective, we want to help talk about the solutions, not necessarily, downplay on certain vendors so much. But it is prevalent. It is prevalent and proven.
All right. Next question is, I actually experienced a ransomware attack on my backup system. How does Unitrends handle security for your appliance? Do I have to keep it up to date manually with new security fixes?
Okay, no, that's a great answer. Great question. Obviously, so for the last one who was asking, you know, if there are examples, this person's an example. From a security perspective, I love this question because in the end, I'm sitting here telling you that it's hardened, it's Linux, there's less management for you, so what are we doing? So with all of our updates, and the appliances, by the way, are heavily supported through cloud-based predictive analytics. And with that, obviously we have hooks into our infrastructure to make sure that systems are kept up to date. So you don't have to go in and manage the specific security patching or anything like that along the lines of our particular Linux appliances. I don't know about other vendors. But with ours, we're able to obviously gather sensors from the appliance. We understand the appliance versions and the security versions, and we keep those up to date in accordance with what we need to based on what we want to be able to expose from those appliances. So the point of all that is that it's managed by your Unitrends, your backup vendor, as a part of the update process that we provide for our code, which includes the operating system and the security aspects of that operating system.
Okay, next question is Unitrends available as a service offering? How is it sold, deployed, and supported in a case where a customer is not tech savvy and needs help?
Great question. So yes, it is available as a service. You still manage the on-premise piece. So we do have service providers that will use Unitrends technology, and if you don't want to even manage on-premise backups at all, they can help with that. So still, you know, if you're looking for someone to just support everything soup to nuts, including the on-premise backups, contact Unitrends. We can get you included with one. We can get you in touch with one of our excellent service providers that can do that for you. If you just buy Unitrends on your own through one of our channel partners, but not a service provider, you would manage the on-premise backup piece. Being a Linux appliance, all you're doing is basically racking, connecting to power, and you're done. You're able to kind of basically already get going with your backups. You just got to connect it into your VMware Hyper-V environment or your Citrix environment or your Windows machines and start backing up. The deployment is insanely simple. On the support side of things, everything is 24/7 support. We don't even have a lower version, so there is never confusion about when you can call in. But even more so around support, a big part of what you see in this message around an appliance is that you have full solution support, and that includes cloud if you're extending the cloud. Unitrends has a cloud that we manage and purpose-built operate it for long-term retention, for DR as a service and failover, as well as recovery assurance to give you that automation and the testing we talked about before, and ransomware detection is a part of everything. So you can get it as an extended cloud service for off-site retention and for DR. And the beauty of that is that entire solution, the backup server, the backup storage, the operating system, the backup software, the security and monitoring of it, including the cloud, all of that is supported by Unitrends in one support phone call. It doesn't get any easier than that when you think about a backup solution. When we talk about removing complexity, and I talked about how a backup architecture can have many components to it, even if you have a simple architecture where it's one server, it still has all those potential products and vendors that are a part of the overall solution, from the hardware through the monitoring and security all the way up to the software and even the cloud. And Unitrends centralizes all that. Again, one support location, one support phone call, and we've actually had a 98% customer satisfaction rating for a long time, and that's been a big part of our pitch. And it's not just because we have good people, it's because that simplification of the overall solution, being in an appliance and connecting transparently to the cloud and having one support call, people love that. But also the infrastructure involved, we're actually sending millions of sensors back from every appliance to help us understand predictively that a hard drive might fail in 7 days. We'll proactively call you and let you know, hey, by the way, you're potentially about to have a hardware issue. We can help you fix that now so that you're not taking downtime. And that's a huge, huge component to how we get to that 98% customer satisfaction rating, is that infrastructure and that proactive predictive analytics around support itself. And that's something that I do think is pretty differentiated. You're not going to see that from many vendors.
The next question is, how do we get, from an existing customer, how do we get the ransomware detection feature in their solution?
So you just need to upgrade to 9.2 in your software. It's standard across all editions with 9.2.
Okay. Next one is, How can you check to see how vulnerable your system is to these types of attacks, or should you just prepare for all scenarios?
That's a really good question. I may suck at giving you a good answer on this one that's outside of the fact that I think it's just important to prepare for many scenarios. When you think about protection, so we talked about, Linux and hardened appliances being, pretty much much less susceptible than Windows backup for being, impacted by ransomware. That doesn't mean that in a couple of months the ransomware world is not going to figure out a way to break that, right? So make sure that when you're protecting your environment, you still have multiple copies of your backups. It's always important to keep in mind those best practices and plan for the worst, right? Murphy's Law. So when you look at the solution you get here and kind of the way we're talking about evaluating backup and continuity as it pertains to ransomware, I think you really do need to think about multi-layered approaches here. So who's going to ultimately be less susceptible? Sure, Linux hardened backup appliances. But should I make sure I have copies of my backup just in case? Heck yeah, absolutely. Should I make sure that I am testing those backups so that I know that they're going to recover and be fine? Absolutely. And should I look for solutions that can be even smarter about ransomware and detect it for me? I think that's an added bonus that is a nice kicker there, because it saves you a lot of data loss situations and can help you recover a lot faster. So I think it's a great question. I think you really need to think about this from the angle that you just can be hit, so I'm going to put plenty of precautions in place to make sure that I know how to recover if I do.
Okay, next question is, can you talk a little bit about how we price our software and appliances and what operating systems we support?
So we have a very, very broad compatibility. I'll do the second question. From the operating system perspective, we have a 250-plus version compatibility matrix. So that includes, at the hypervisor level, VMware, Hyper-V, and Citrix Zen Server at a deep hypervisor integration perspective. But we can also support any other hypervisor by basically, putting agents on the virtual machines and backing them up that way. And that includes KVM, Nutanix's Acropolis hypervisor, Oracle VM, and many others. When you think about what you can do on the physical side of things, we support Windows all the way back, I think even earlier than 2003. Lots of Linux distributions, many Unix as well. So it's usually pretty tough to find something we don't support from a backup and recovery perspective, and I would definitely recommend going to our website and checking out our compatibility matrix to make sure that we can cover your environment. On the other components to the question, Kevin, you know what? I took so long on that one. Can you read the first part again?
Yeah. How do we actually price our software and appliances?
Right. So for our appliances, it's a full boat type of situation. You're going to have one price, and it'll cover all the software and everything you protect and whatever you can fit on that appliance. There are two editions of it based on the functionality you need. If you want that really cool automation that we talked about, that's available in our Enterprise Plus version. If you want to scale back and you have some budget issues and you can be comfortable without that, then we do have an enterprise version that's less expensive for each appliance. And there's 12 models going from 2 terabytes to 180 terabytes. And if you have a huge environment and you need to scale out, in a single centrally managed implementation, we just launched a new feature that allows us to centrally manage up to 10,000 of our appliances. So that's almost 2 exabytes of data, so we can scale. But the good thing is, whether you only have a couple of terabytes that you need to protect, we have a model for you that will help you reduce costs. And with 2 editions of our appliances, I think the smallest one that we have starts at about $2K MSRP, and all the pricing's on the website. So you can kind of go check all that out and see the details. For the virtual appliance, Unitrends Backup Virtual Appliance, which still gets you all the hardened Linux and everything, it's just you're using your own hardware. That actually has 4 editions, including a free one, by the way. So there's a free version up to a terabyte, and we have standard, we have an Essentials, Standard, Enterprise, Enterprise Plus. I think our lowest one starts at about 300 or so per server or socket. So for any physical server, you'll want a server license. For any hypervisor like VMware, Hyper-V, or Zen Server, you'll price by socket. And that's kind of how the pricing scales there. And again, starts at, just basically, I think it's at about $349 for the cheapest paid version. per socket. All that's available on our website.
Okay, next question is, if I wanted to run my own testing scripts in your automation workflow, can I do that?
Absolutely. I don't know if you noticed on the screenshot I had before, but it did actually have a custom script option. So within each guest, as a part of your plan, you can even run something custom that's specific to your environment. It could be a security scan, specifically looking for a certain flavor of ransomware or some other type of malware. It could be anything else you want to basically test.
Okay, and here's a couple of questions kind of around ransomware detection. First one is, are there any security features implemented into the appliance or software to proactively protect backups at the hint of a threat?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think that describes kind of what our detection feature does. Basically, as we're backing up, we're going to be analyzing the metadata of the backups over time, and we're going to understand steady state and anomalies very, very clearly. So when ransomware occurs, we know how to look for certain conditions that pop up as a result of certain anomalies. So as soon as we do a backup where we start to see an anomaly exist, we're going to immediately alert you and let you know, hey, this particular system or these 5 systems are a threat for being hit by ransomware. You should check them out immediately. So I think that answers the question, but if I didn't, please follow up.
Okay, and then probably a follow-up to this is, will a detection feature give me an alert for every system infected or a summary alert?
Good question, right? Because you don't want to get hit with 8 million alerts all at once if you happen to get infected all over the network. And that's an unfortunate situation, but it definitely happens. So we actually do roll up the alerting for this particular feature so that when you get an alert, if we detect it on multiple systems as a part of our backups, we'll give you one alert that tells you the different systems that were impacted. That way you don't get flooded.
Okay. One last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Does your automated testing only run in the Unitrends cloud, or can I run it in my own colo?
So you can run it anywhere you want. It can be run on premise where your local backups are. It can be run in a secondary site of your own, wherever that might be, or it can run in the Unitrends cloud.
Okay. Well, I think that's just about it. Thanks, everybody, for attending. We appreciate your time. We'll be notifying the winner of the $100 Amazon gift card via email later today or tomorrow. And we'll also be sending out a follow-up email that has some of these additional resources that you've seen, as well as a recording to the webinar itself. We'll also announce the winner of the gift card in that email also. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Take care, everybody.